Welcome, dear friends, to a gentle journey through the forgotten world of Fallout, where vaults, once built to shield humanity from the horrors of a post apocalyptic world, are now icons of mystery and survival. Tonight, we will drift through 140 fascinating facts about the vaults of Fallout, a place of hope, fear, and the unknown hidden beneath the earth, waiting for those who seek refuge from a devastated world. From the design of these vaults to the peculiar experiments and stories that unfold within them, you will learn of the vaults that became symbols of shelter, of science, and sometimes of secrets too dark to be shared. As we move through these stories, let your mind wander, feel the soft comfort of the world created in these vaults, and allow yourself to drift deeper into rest. Now take a deep breath and let the tension of the day slowly release. With each breath, feel yourself becoming lighter, your thoughts gentler. The world outside fades away, and the quiet, steady rhythm of your breath guides you into a calm, peaceful place. If you find comfort in these quiet journeys, feel free to subscribe and softly let me know where you're listening from tonight. Now let's begin our journey into the vaults. Let your mind settle as we explore the first few facts together. Fact 1. The vaults were designed as a place of refuge, built to protect humanity from nuclear fallout after World War III. While most of the vaults were intended to preserve life, some were secretly designed to conduct experiments on the survivors inside, turning these shelters into places of strange, often sinister experimentation. These vaults are a chilling reminder of the dual purpose of safety and control. Despite their primary function as survival havens, the vaults became entangled with twisted tests, each one more bizarre than the last, leaving an eerie legacy in their wake. Fact 2. Vault 13, one of the most famous vaults, was the setting for the original Fallout game. Designed as a typical survival shelter, its residents faced a tragic fate when the vault's water chip malfunctioned, causing a dire water shortage. The inhabitants were forced to leave their sanctuary, becoming the first to experience the outside world's dangerous, desolate landscape. This event sets the stage for the vault's dark history, revealing how even the most well-intentioned shelter could lead to unforeseen consequences, with every decision echoing the uncertainty of a fractured world. Fact 3. Vault 76, a key vault in Fallout lore, was designed to house a small population of survivors, to be opened 20 years after the nuclear apocalypse. Unlike other vaults, which were built with hidden purposes, Vault 76 was intended to be a test of the ideal post-apocalyptic society. Its purpose was to rebuild America, but when the vault's doors finally opened, it revealed an empty wasteland. The inhabitants had failed to survive, and the vault's bright future quickly turned to dust, leaving behind a desolate world filled with grief, struggle, and the echoes of lost dreams. Fact 4. Vault 101, a place of safety in Fallout 3, kept its doors sealed for generations, ensuring that its inhabitants never set foot outside. This vault became the epitome of isolation, with the outside world being nothing more than a distant myth. Its residents lived in peace, unaware of the horrors beyond their walls, but their blissful ignorance was shattered when a tragedy forced one of their own to leave. Vault 101's closure represents the delicate balance between comfort and the overwhelming desire to seek answers, showing how safety can sometimes breed confusion and fear. Fact 5. Vault 95 was the site of one of the most tragic experiments ever conducted. Its residents were subjected to an experiment that forced them into addiction, with the vault's overseer encouraging the use of chems, particularly the addictive substance jet. As the experiment unfolded, residents fell into dependency, and the vault's purpose shifted from survival to control. The test was a cruel exploration of addiction's hold on the human spirit, leaving a legacy of sorrow and regret. Vault 95 stands as a grim reminder of humanity's darkest impulses when given power over others' lives. Fact 6, Vault 111, featured in Fallout 4, is perhaps one of the most tragic in its design. The vault was created to house its residents in stasis pods, preserving them for 200 years. But when the vault's overseers decided to use the residents as mere test subjects for cryogenic freezing, tragedy struck. While the vault's occupants were placed in stasis, the world outside underwent devastating changes. Vault 111's tale is one of lost time, as its inhabitants awoke to a world irrevocably altered, where the weight of what had been lost was far heavier than the cold silence of the vault. Fact 7. Vault 22 was another vault with a dark secret. Instead of protecting its inhabitants from the horrors of the outside world, the vault was used to test new agricultural technologies. The experiment sought to create genetically modified plants capable of thriving in harsh conditions. However, this came at a steep cost. Many of the vault's inhabitants were killed, and the crops turned into monstrous mutated plants that would later spread throughout the wasteland. Vault 22 serves as a chilling reminder that the pursuit of progress can have unforeseen and horrifying consequences as nature fights back against mankind's interference. Fact 8. Vault 87, infamous for its twisted experiments on its residents, was one of the most deranged examples of Vault Tech's secretive work. It was the site of horrific mutations, where genetic manipulation created some of the most terrifying creatures in Fallout lore, the feral ghouls and the super mutants. These abominations were created as part of an attempt to breed a new, superior race of humans. Vault 87 stands as a testament to the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition, where the line between progress and monstrosity is easily blurred, leaving behind a world of suffering and chaos. Fact 9. Vault 19's experiment revolved around psychology, a chilling test of human behavior in extreme conditions. The vault's inhabitants were separated into two factions, each with its own ideology. The intent was to see how long these factions could coexist in confined spaces, but as tensions rose, so did violence. The residents' lives became a reflection of the worst aspects of human nature: fear, conflict, and the struggle for control. Vault 19 shows that even in isolation, humanity's deep-seated need for power and dominance can lead to destructive outcomes, making survival a test of moral endurance. Fact 10. Vault 21, in contrast, was designed as a place where gambling and entertainment were the focal points of the community. The vault's overseer created an environment where games of chance, rather than survival, dominated daily life. While the experiment may have been intended as a light-hearted reflection of human desires, it ultimately led to chaos. The vault's residents lived in an environment of constant risk, where their fates were determined by luck rather than preparation. Vault 21 represents humanity's obsession with chance and the unpredictable nature of life, where the smallest turn of fate can change everything. Fact 11. Vault 56 was designed to test the effects of isolation on its residents. Its inhabitants were sealed away, with no contact with the outside world or each other, forced to live in complete solitude. The vault's experiment sought to understand how long people could endure total isolation without suffering severe psychological breakdowns. Over time, the once vibrant individuals became mere shadows of themselves, their minds unraveling in the quiet void. Vault 56 stands as a somber reminder of the importance of human connection and how the absence of it can lead to a soul's silent decay. Fact 12. Vault 12's experiment focused on radiation exposure, exploring how human bodies might react to prolonged exposure to radioactive materials. Located near a radioactive source, the vault was meant to test human survival in environments tainted by radiation. As time passed, the vault's inhabitants mutated into the terrifying ghouls, a tragic reminder of the human cost of these experiments. Vault 12's legacy lingers in the form of the ghoul population scattered across the wasteland, a haunting reflection of the dangers of tampering with forces beyond our understanding with the price paid in flesh and bone. Fact 13. Vault 77 is a peculiar vault with a strange and lonely story. It housed only one inhabitant, an eccentric man with a puppet named the Overseer. The vault was intended as an experiment in extreme loneliness, with the aim of studying the effects on a single individual. The solitary man's only company was his puppet, and this odd scenario quickly turned into an unsettling display of madness. Vault 77's tragic story is a chilling reminder of how the mind can fracture when pushed to extremes and how loneliness can distort one's perception of reality. Fact 14. Vault 95's purpose was to test the effects of addiction and dependency. As part of the experiment, the vault's residents were deliberately exposed to chems, leading them to fall into devastating addiction. The vault became a grim testament to the dangers of substance abuse, with the once hopeful experiment spiraling into destruction. Those who resided in Vault 95 struggled against a dependency they could not escape, their lives forever altered by the addictive substances. Vault 95 serves as a reminder of how the pursuit of control can lead to the collapse of human dignity and will. Fact 15. Vault 108 was home to an unsettling experiment involving cloning. Within its walls, a scientist used cloning technology to create endless copies of a single individual. The clones, all identical in appearance and personality, were doomed to live out their days in an endless cycle of repetition. This experiment, meant to explore human identity and individuality, became a nightmare of confusion and loss. The clones, eventually driven to madness, represent the tragic consequences of tampering with the very essence of what makes us human, as their existence was reduced to a mere copy of a copy. Fact 16. Vault 92 focused on the effects of music on the human mind. The vault's residents were exposed to constant experimental music, which was meant to influence their emotions and behavior. While the experiment sought to uncover the therapeutic effects of music, it soon took a darker turn. The residents began to lose their ability to think independently, becoming increasingly mindless and dependent on the constant flow of sound. Vault 92 is a haunting reminder of the power of music, both as a tool for healing and as a subtle weapon that can control the mind if used without care. Fact 17. Vault 101's motto was, "The vault's the most important thing," a simple phrase that encapsulated the vault's purpose, to maintain the safety and survival of its residents at any cost. But this motto took on a darker meaning as the vault's residents became increasingly isolated from the outside world. The constant assurance that they were safe inside led to a mindset where the vault became their entire reality. When the doors finally opened, the world beyond was both a dream and a nightmare, revealing the high cost of protecting humanity in a bubble that could never truly last. Fact 18: Vault 14's experiment was based on studying human society's responses to rationing and resource scarcity. The vault's inhabitants were given a limited supply of food and water, forcing them to adapt to extreme scarcity. As the days passed, residents became more desperate, and tensions grew as everyone fought to ensure their survival. Vault 14's experiment ended in chaos, revealing that humans, when pushed to their limits, will often turn on each other. The vault serves as a stark reminder of the delicate balance between cooperation and competition, and how quickly it can tip into survivalism. Fact 19: Vault 28 was one of the more hopeful experiments in Vault Tech's history. It was designed to study the effects of a peaceful, utopian society where its inhabitants were given the freedom to live without the burdens of war, fear, or violence. But the experiment fell apart when the vault's population began to focus too heavily on their own comforts. Eventually, the vault became a place of selfishness where the residents turned inward, abandoning the principles of cooperation and community. Vault 28's failure is a reminder that even the best intentions can be derailed by human nature's darker side. Fact 20: Vault 108's cloning experiment resulted in the creation of many clones of a single man, resulting in a bizarre and eerie environment. These clones, devoid of any true identity, became hostile toward each other as their individuality was erased in the endless duplication process. This vault's story is one of lost humanity, where the pursuit of scientific progress took the form of a cruel, unending cycle. The inhabitants of Vault 108 serve as a chilling reflection of what happens when science pushes too far into the realm of human nature, leaving behind only shadows of what once was. Fact 21: Vault 92's music experiment took a sinister turn when the melodies intended to calm and soothe were used as a method of control. The vault's residents, continuously exposed to the tunes, slowly lost their ability to think for themselves, becoming dependent on the music for guidance and emotional regulation. The experiment was a subtle form of psychological manipulation, where the power of sound became a tool of subjugation. Vault 92 reminds us that music, a source of solace and expression, can also be weaponized, twisting a once joyous thing into a force that strips away individuality and free will. Fact 22: Vault 21, designed around the concept of gambling and games of chance, was a bizarre experiment in luck and fate. The vault's residents lived in a world where the outcome of their lives could be determined by dice rolls and card games. The idea was to explore the unpredictability of human decisions in an environment driven by chance, but it soon devolved into chaos. Instead of fostering camaraderie, the constant uncertainty caused distrust and competition. Vault 21's lesson is clear. The randomness of life can lead to more destruction than harmony, as the desire to win overtakes human connection. Fact 23: Vault 92's residents were subjected to continuous and escalating doses of music designed to alter their emotions and perceptions. As the experiment continued, the inhabitants became unable to distinguish between their own thoughts and the sounds they were forced to listen to. The music's influence eroded their identities, leaving them unable to think independently. What was intended to be a harmless experiment in emotional influence instead became a nightmare of control. Vault 92 teaches us that the mind, once manipulated by external forces, can lose its connection to itself, leaving behind empty vessels wandering in a maze of sound. Fact 24. Vault 87, known for its horrific experiments in genetic manipulation, became the birthplace of the terrifying supermutants. The vault's residents were subjected to forced exposure to FEV, forced evolutionary virus, a substance meant to create a new breed of superhuman soldiers. Instead of creating stronger individuals, the experiments twisted the bodies and minds of the residents, turning them into grotesque, inhuman creatures. Vault 87's story serves as a warning about the dangers of genetic tampering and the unintended consequences that can arise when humanity plays with forces it does not fully understand. Fact 25. Vault 22's agricultural experiment quickly turned disastrous as its genetically modified crops began to mutate and become dangerous. What was once an attempt to create resilient plants for survival turned into a nightmare as the plants grew uncontrollable, releasing deadly spores and causing the death of many vault residents. This vault, originally designed to safeguard humanity through agricultural innovation, became a breeding ground for mutation. Vault 22 stands as a testament to how attempts to conquer nature's limits can lead to unforeseen consequences, reminding us of the fragility of life in the face of unchecked ambition. Fact 26. Vault 34 was constructed to test the effects of constant exposure to extreme noise. Inside its walls, residents lived in a constant barrage of sounds, meant to measure their psychological response to a never-ending cacophony. The vault's experiment soon led to a breakdown in mental health, as the noise proved to be unbearable for its inhabitants. The noise that was supposed to be an environmental test became a constant source of suffering, driving residents to madness. Vault 34 illustrates the overwhelming power of sound and how it can shape the mind in ways that are both harmful and irreversible. Fact 27. Vault 101's motto, "The vault's the most important thing," was a mantra repeated by its overseer, emphasizing the importance of the vault as the sole bastion of safety. However, this belief kept the residents isolated from the outside world for generations, causing them to live in ignorance of the true dangers that lay beyond. When the vault's door finally opened, the world was a harsh, unforgiving place, and the peace once promised inside the vault had been shattered. Vault 101's story serves as a reminder that isolation can lead to misplaced beliefs, where safety becomes a prison. Fact 28. Vault 19 was a test in psychological isolation, forcing its inhabitants into separate factions based on their personalities. The Vault's experiment sought to see how groups with radically different ideologies would interact under stress. But it soon became apparent that division led to violence and chaos. The factions turned against one another, each group struggling for dominance. Vault 19 serves as a warning about the dangers of artificial division and the destructive potential of forced ideological conflict. When people are pitted against each other, cooperation becomes impossible and survival becomes a war of wills rather than unity. Fact 29. Vault 76 was built as a symbol of hope for the future, meant to house a select group of individuals who would emerge 20 years after the nuclear apocalypse to rebuild the world. However, when the vault opened, it was met with disappointment. The hopeful plan to restore civilization was marred by chaos, as the vault's inhabitants found themselves in an empty wasteland with no clear path forward. Vault 76's story is a reminder that hope alone is not enough to rebuild a broken world. It requires effort, resilience, and unity, qualities that were hard to find in the wasteland. Fact 30. Vault 111 was designed to house its residents in cryogenic stasis, preserving them for 200 years. But what was supposed to be a preservation of life turned into a nightmare when the vault's inhabitants were unknowingly frozen while the world outside continued to change. When they finally awoke, the world was unrecognizable, and they were left to navigate a post apocalyptic landscape. Vault 111's story is a poignant reminder of the passage of time and the irreversible changes that occur when one is separated from the flow of life. It speaks to the cost of frozen hopes. Fact 31. Vault 53 was designed to test how its residents would react to being in complete darkness for extended periods. The vault's experiment focused on sensory deprivation, with inhabitants living in an environment where light never touched their eyes. Over time, the lack of visual stimuli caused a profound shift in their perceptions of reality. The darkness, initially intended to simulate isolation, gradually became a suffocating presence. Vault 53 serves as a stark reminder of how essential light is to the human spirit and how its absence can distort our very sense of existence. Fact 32. Vault 64's residents were subjected to an experiment involving extreme levels of luxury and comfort. While many vaults focused on survival and control, Vault 64 was built to pamper its inhabitants, providing them with excess food, entertainment, and amenities. The intent was to see if an excess of pleasure would lead to happiness, but it instead created a society of indulgence and apathy. The residents grew complacent, eventually losing any desire to leave the vault or confront the harsh realities of the outside world. Vault 64 reveals the danger of excess, where comfort breeds stagnation. Fact 33. Vault 92's residents were subjected to an experiment in emotional manipulation through music. What was initially designed to bring peace and calm soon turned into a psychological nightmare, as the vault's inhabitants became increasingly dependent on the continuous music they were forced to listen to. The melodies, meant to soothe, soon took control of the residents' minds, erasing their sense of self and replacing it with an overwhelming need for the music. Vault 92 stands as a haunting example of how something as beautiful as music can become an instrument of control and manipulation. Fact 34. Vault 77 is known for its bizarre and lonely experiment involving a single man and a puppet. The vault was designed for one solitary inhabitant who was isolated with nothing but his puppet, which he named the Overseer. This strange experiment studied the effects of absolute loneliness, where the man's only companion was a puppet, an object of his own creation. Vault 77's tale is a tragic reminder of how isolation can bend the human mind, turning a man into something unrecognizable, caught between his own reality and the puppet he believes to be his overseer. Fact 35. Vault 95's experiment was a cruel test of addiction. Residents were intentionally exposed to the powerful stimulant jet in hopes of studying its effects on the human psyche. Instead of becoming resilient to the substance, the vault's inhabitants became dependent on it, their lives spiraling into chaos as they struggled to escape the grip of addiction. Vault 95's grim history serves as a warning about the dangers of substance abuse and the cruelty that can arise when people's weaknesses are used for experimentation. The vault's residents were left to battle addiction with no real help in sight. Fact 36. Vault 15 was intended as an experiment in communal living. Its design sought to explore how various groups with different ideologies could coexist in a confined space. However, the vault's inhabitants, divided into factions with conflicting beliefs, quickly descended into conflict. Over time, the vault became a battlefield for ideological power struggles. Vault 15 teaches us that even the best intentioned experiments in unity can falter when deeply rooted differences are forced to coexist. The Vault's story highlights the fragile nature of cooperation and the difficulty of bridging ideological divides in the face of scarcity and fear. Fact 37. Vault 14 was another vault focused on a social experiment, this time exploring the effects of strict resource rationing. The vault's residents were forced to live with limited food, water, and supplies, meant to test how humans would adapt to extreme scarcity. As the residents struggled to make do with what little they had, tensions rose and alliances formed around the few resources available. Vault 14's experiment ultimately revealed that scarcity can bring out the worst in people, as competition for survival eclipses cooperation, turning a community into a battleground for basic necessities. Fact 38. Vault 12, located in a highly radioactive area, was designed to test how human beings would survive in extreme radiation. The vault's residents were exposed to constant radiation, which slowly altered their biology. Over time, the vault's inhabitants transformed into the terrifying feral ghouls, a testament to the power of radiation's mutative effects. Vault 12's tragic fate reminds us of the destructive force of radiation, where survival becomes a matter of enduring unthinkable conditions, and where the line between life and death blurs in the face of such extreme exposure. Fact 39. Vault 106 was built to test the effects of hallucinogenic gas on its residents. The vault's inhabitants were exposed to a chemical agent that induced intense hallucinations, meant to study how people would cope with altered states of consciousness. As the residents lost touch with reality, the vault descended into madness. The experiment became a horrifying glimpse into the mind's fragility, where the boundary between illusion and truth dissolved. Vault 106 is a reminder of the mind's vulnerability and how easily one's perception of the world can be manipulated, leading to chaos and confusion. Fact 40. Vault 66, located in a remote area, was designed as an experiment to observe the effects of having no access to basic amenities like food or water. The vault's inhabitants were left with no resources and were forced to fend for themselves. The idea was to see how long people could survive without the basics of life. As time passed, the vault's residents began to turn on each other, fighting for survival in a world where even the smallest resources were considered treasures. Vault 66's brutal history serves as a stark reminder of the essential need for community and cooperation in times of crisis. Fact 41. Vault 76, designed to be a beacon of hope, was one of the few vaults built with a clear purpose: to emerge and rebuild civilization. Vault Tech's original plan was for the vault's inhabitants to leave 20 years after the Great War, emerging into a world that would be ready for reconstruction. However, when the doors finally opened, they found only a wasteland, leaving them unprepared to face the dangers of a ruined world. Vault 76's story serves as a reminder of the fragility of human plans and how even the brightest intentions can falter in the face of unforeseen challenges. Fact 42. Vault 21 with its focus on gambling and chance, reflected the unpredictability of life. Inside the vault, everything from food to shelter was determined by the roll of dice or the turn of a card. The vault's inhabitants were constantly gambling with their fates, with no certainty in any decision. What was meant to be a fun, light-hearted social experiment soon became an exercise in anxiety and fear. Vault 21 shows that while humans may be drawn to risk and chance, too much uncertainty can cause instability, leading to chaos instead of community. Fact 43. Vault 87, one of the most infamous vaults, was the site of brutal experiments using the forced evolutionary virus, FEV. The vault's inhabitants were exposed to the virus, which mutated them into grotesque, monstrous forms. These mutations, intended to create a new breed of superhumans, instead resulted in the creation of the terrifying supermutants and feral ghouls. Vault 87's cruel experiment on its residents serves as a grim reminder of the dangers of tampering with genetics, showing how the pursuit of power can lead to unimaginable consequences for both body and mind. Fact 44. Vault 92 was a music-based experiment designed to explore how sound could affect emotions and behavior. The vault's inhabitants were subjected to continuous music intended to influence their moods and decision-making. However, the experiment took a darker turn, as the constant barrage of sound eventually caused residents to lose their ability to think independently. Vault 92's residents became dependent on the music, unable to function without it. The vault's story serves as a haunting reminder of how easily our emotions can be manipulated through external forces, turning something as beautiful as music into a means of control. Fact 45. Vault 106's experiment involved hallucinogenic gas meant to induce extreme hallucinations in the residents. The vault's inhabitants were exposed to the gas for long periods, causing them to experience vivid, terrifying illusions that blurred the line between reality and fiction. As time passed, the vault descended into madness, with residents losing their sense of self and their grip on reality. Vault 106's tragic experiment demonstrates the mind's fragility when pushed to its limits, showing how quickly one's perception of the world can be distorted, leading to chaos and destruction. Fact 46. Vault 108 was the site of one of Vault-Tech's most disturbing experiments, cloning. The vault's inhabitants were cloned repeatedly, with one person being duplicated endlessly. The clones were all identical to the original, leading to a lack of individuality and identity. As the experiment progressed, the clones began to exhibit violent tendencies, eventually turning on each other. Vault 108 stands as a chilling reminder of how the loss of individuality can lead to a breakdown in society, showing the dangers of trying to replicate human beings without considering the psychological and emotional costs. Fact 47. Vault 95, known for its experiment in addiction, was a place where residents were intentionally exposed to chems. The goal was to study the effects of long-term addiction on the human psyche. However, instead of studying the effects, the vault's residents became trapped in cycles of dependency, their lives consumed by the drugs they had been forced to use. Vault 95's tragic experiment illustrates the dangers of manipulating people's weaknesses for the sake of science, showing how addiction can quickly spiral out of control, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. Fact 48. Vault 22, built as an agricultural experiment, turned into a nightmare when genetically modified crops began to mutate. The vault's goal was to create plants that could withstand harsh environments, but the result was a horrific breed of mutated plants. These plants released deadly spores that killed many residents and mutated the rest. Vault 22's tale serves as a cautionary reminder of the dangers of playing with nature's balance, as even the best intentioned experiments can lead to chaos and destruction when humanity's ambition exceeds its understanding of the natural world. Fact 49. Vault 66 was designed as a test to see how people would survive with absolutely no resources. The vault's inhabitants were deprived of food, water, and basic necessities, forced to rely on their own ingenuity to survive. The experiment was meant to study human survival in extreme conditions, but it soon became clear that the residents' struggles for basic needs led to violence and chaos. Vault 66 stands as a grim reminder of how vital resources are to life and how easily society can collapse when these essential elements are stripped away. Fact 50. Vault 111 was intended as a safe haven for its residents, but its purpose changed when the inhabitants were placed into cryogenic stasis. They were meant to sleep through the worst of the apocalypse, only to awaken once the world was safe again. However, due to a tragic turn of events, the vault's residents remained frozen while the world outside changed irrevocably. Vault 111's story highlights the danger of putting one's faith in technology, as the passage of time left its inhabitants stranded in a world they no longer recognized. Fact 51. Vault 27's experiment focused on the psychological effects of overcrowding. The vault was built to house far more people than it was designed for, forcing its inhabitants to live in constant close quarters. The cramped conditions led to extreme stress and anxiety, with residents becoming increasingly hostile toward each other. The vault's experiment, meant to test the limits of human tolerance, ultimately resulted in chaos. Vault 27 is a chilling reminder of how overcrowding and lack of personal space can erode a community's sense of well being, turning cooperation into conflict. Fact 52. Vault 63 was one of the most ambitious experiments designed to study human resilience by testing the limits of deprivation. The vault's inhabitants were placed in a state of constant scarcity, with no resources other than what they could grow or scavenge. This severe limitation was meant to see how humans would adapt to an environment of continual need. However, the vault quickly descended into desperation, and the residents' hope for survival eroded. Vault 63 serves as a haunting reminder that even the strongest human spirit can falter when pushed to the edge of endurance. Fact 53. Vault 39's experiment involved studying the effects of genetic purity on human populations. In an attempt to create a perfect genetic pool, the vault's inhabitants were subject to strict genetic screening and forced sterilization. The goal was to create a genetically superior population, but this sterile experiment left the vault's residents devoid of future generations. Vault 39 is a dark reminder of the perils of attempting to control humanity's genetic makeup, showing how such rigid ideologies can strip away the diversity and hope that make us human. Fact 54. Vault 49 was a test of how people could survive under extreme emotional stress. Its residents were subjected to constant psychological pressure, with the goal of seeing how they would react when forced to live in a state of perpetual anxiety. Over time, The vault's inhabitants became paranoid and fearful, unable to trust anyone, even those closest to them. Vault 49's story is a grim testament to the power of psychological manipulation, reminding us of the deep impact emotional stress can have on the mind, especially when it becomes a never ending presence. Fact 55: Vault 63, while designed to study human endurance, focused on extreme isolation, pushing its residents to their breaking points. Isolated from each other in separate chambers, the vault's inhabitants were forbidden from speaking or interacting. This lack of human connection led to severe psychological strain, with the residents slowly losing their sense of identity and reality. Vault 63's failure highlights how deeply humans need connection with others, and how isolation can unravel even the strongest minds, leaving behind broken spirits lost in their own silence. Fact 56: Vault 78's experiment involved complete freedom, where its residents were given no rules or regulations to govern their lives. Instead of studying survival or psychology, the vault's focus was on chaos and freedom, testing how an unregulated society would function. However, the vault quickly descended into anarchy as the lack of structure led to constant conflict. Vault 78 stands as a stark reminder that too much freedom without boundaries can result in complete breakdowns in society, where the absence of order breeds disorder instead of opportunity. Fact 57: Vault 50's residents were tasked with living in a vault with no knowledge of the outside world. Sealed away for generations, the vault's inhabitants were told nothing of the world they were meant to rebuild. The vault's creators believed that without outside distractions, the residents could focus entirely on rebuilding society. However, this isolation led to confusion and unrest. When the vault's doors were eventually opened, the residents were left unprepared and uncertain. Vault 50's experiment illustrates the dangers of total isolation, leaving people unmoored and unable to connect with the reality they now face. Fact 58: Vault 45's experiment was a psychological one aimed at studying the effects of extreme boredom and monotony on human behavior. Its residents were kept in a repetitive, unchanging environment with no new stimuli. The vault's creators believed that studying the effects of boredom would provide valuable insights into the human mind. However, the lack of change and variety drove the inhabitants to madness, with many succumbing to despair. Vault 45's tragic story is a reminder of the power of novelty and stimulation in the human experience, showing how monotony can erode mental health and happiness. Fact 59: Vault 51 was a social experiment designed to test the power dynamics within a community. The vault's residents were split into two groups and tasked with a single goal: survival. However, the experiment's creators left the residents to navigate their own power structures with no guidance or authority. This led to a struggle for control, with both factions attempting to dominate the other. Vault 51's story serves as a chilling reminder of the forces of power and hierarchy, and how the pursuit of control can tear a community apart from within, turning survival into a battle for dominance. Fact 60: Vault 61 was designed to test how long a population could survive on a single resource. The vault's inhabitants were given only one food source, a single type of grain. The experiment aimed to see how humans would adapt to such a restrictive diet. Over time, the residents' health began to decline, and their ability to function as a society deteriorated. Vault 61's experiment demonstrates the dangers of monoculture and the importance of variety in sustaining life, showing that even the simplest resources can become a dangerous limitation when used without thought or care. Fact 61: Vault 48's experiment revolved around the isolation of its inhabitants from the outside world. The residents were told that they were the last survivors of humanity, with no hope of ever seeing another soul again. This sense of total abandonment was meant to test the limits of human hope and survival. Over time, the residents' morale declined, and some even turned on each other as the idea of a future without anyone else became unbearable. Vault 48's tragic experiment shows how vital human connection is to our survival and how isolation can destroy even the strongest spirit. Fact 62: Vault 21 was designed around the theme of luck, where everything, food, shelter, and even life itself, was determined by gambling. The vault's inhabitants played games of chance to secure their needs, and while it seemed like a fun experiment, it soon turned into a dangerous cycle of addiction and anxiety. The constant uncertainty eroded the residents' sense of safety, and their fate was often left to luck rather than preparation. Vault 21's story serves as a warning that when the stakes are too high, luck can become a dangerous game, leading to chaos instead of stability. Fact 63: Vault 92's experiment with music had unintended consequences. What was meant to calm and comfort the residents instead led to a loss of individuality. The continuous music played within the vault began to alter the residents' behavior, making them dependent on the soothing melodies. Over time, they became incapable of making decisions without the music's influence, losing their sense of self in the process. Vault 92's experiment highlights the power of sound and its potential to manipulate emotions, turning something as beautiful as music into a force of control that erases personal autonomy. Fact 64: Vault 95's addiction experiment involved exposing its residents to chems, forcing them into cycles of dependency. The vault's creators believed they could study the effects of long-term addiction, but the experiment quickly spiraled out of control. Instead of providing valuable data, the vault's inhabitants succumbed to their addictions, losing all sense of autonomy. Vault 95's tragic story serves as a reminder of the destructive power of addiction and the dangers of using people as subjects in cruel experiments. What was meant to be an observation became a lifetime of suffering for those trapped inside. Fact 65: Vault 108's cloning experiment created a population of identical individuals, each a copy of the original. The vault's intent was to study the effects of genetic replication, but it soon led to a breakdown in individuality. The clones, bereft of any sense of uniqueness, began to lose their minds, creating a disturbing environment. The vault's experiment, meant to push the boundaries of science, resulted in an endless cycle of repetition and madness. Vault 108's story serves as a chilling reminder that our identities are what make us human, and losing that uniqueness can lead to chaos. Fact 66: Vault 77 was a peculiar experiment, housing only a single man and his puppet, the Overseer. The experiment sought to see how one person could cope with total isolation. However, the loneliness soon drove the man to madness, as he became fixated on the puppet. Vault 77's bizarre story reveals how the human mind can twist in response to extreme isolation. The man's reliance on his puppet highlights the deep need for companionship and the psychological toll that loneliness can take, as even an inanimate object can take on the weight of human connection. Fact 67. Vault 87's experiment, which involved exposure to the forced evolutionary virus, FEV, resulted in the creation of the horrifying supermutants. The vault's inhabitants were subjected to the virus, intended to create a new breed of superhuman soldiers. However, the experiment went horribly wrong, leading to the mutation of the vault's population into monstrous forms. Vault 87's tragic outcome serves as a stark warning about the dangers of tampering with human biology, showing how attempts to improve humanity can often result in horrors beyond imagination, leaving behind a legacy of suffering. Fact 68. Vault 64 was designed to study the effects of luxury and excess on human behavior. The vault's inhabitants were given everything they needed and more: food, shelter, and entertainment. But what was meant to be an experiment in comforts soon became a breeding ground for laziness and complacency. The residents, living in constant indulgence, lost their drive and their sense of purpose. Vault 64's story shows how excess can undermine the human spirit, turning what should have been a paradise into a prison of apathy and stagnation, where the pursuit of pleasure became a trap. Fact 69. Vault 66's experiment, a test of survival in the absence of resources, led to a brutal battle for basic necessities. The vault's inhabitants were given nothing: no food, no water, no basic comforts, and were forced to rely solely on their wits and ingenuity. The result was chaos, as the residents fought for every scrap of food and water, with violence escalating as the days went on. Vault 66's story is a grim reminder of the importance of resources in survival and how easily a community can devolve into violence when survival itself becomes the only priority. Fact 70. Vault 92 was the setting for a haunting experiment that exposed its residents to continuous music. Meant to influence emotions and behavior, the music slowly became a tool of control. Over time, the vault's inhabitants became addicted to the music, their minds dulled by its constant presence. The vault's residents lost the ability to think freely, becoming mere puppets to the melodies that once were meant to soothe. Vault 92 serves as a chilling reminder of the power of sound and its ability to shape and manipulate the human mind when used without restraint. Fact 71. Vault 33 was built to test the effects of confinement on a group of people with contrasting personalities. The residents were a mix of different temperaments, beliefs, and temperaments, placed together in a confined space with no way to escape. Initially, the vault's designers believed the diversity would foster creativity and innovation. However, the isolation, compounded by the lack of cooperation, led to tension and conflict. Vault 33's failed experiment serves as a stark reminder of how isolation and forced diversity can result in friction rather than harmony when there's no mutual understanding or shared purpose. Fact 72. Vault 69, a bizarre experiment designed to test human relationships, was populated with an unbalanced gender ratio, creating a 1-to-1 ratio of men to women. The vault's purpose was to study how such a setup would affect relationships and social structures. As time passed, the imbalance led to a breakdown in social order, as the vault's inhabitants became obsessed with pairing off and creating families. Vault 69's experiment highlights the unintended consequences of artificial social engineering, showing how even the best intentions can lead to complications that spiral out of control when human nature is manipulated. Fact 73. Vault 59 focused on studying the effects of extreme monotony. Its inhabitants were forced to live in a perfectly uniform environment with no variation in their daily routines. Each day, the same repetitive tasks were performed, and the surroundings remained unchanged. The experiment aimed to study human behavior in a controlled, predictable environment. However, the results were devastating, as the residents soon became mentally unstable, unable to cope with the lack of novelty. Vault 59 stands as a powerful warning of how essential variety is to maintaining mental health and how monotony can break the human spirit. Fact 74. Vault 56 was an experiment in sensory deprivation, where the residents were kept in complete darkness and silence for an extended period. The vault's inhabitants were cut off from all external stimuli, including light and sound, to observe how they would cope. Over time, the lack of sensory input caused severe psychological effects, with many residents descending into madness. Vault 56's experiment reveals how deeply our senses shape our reality and how the absence of these basic inputs can disrupt the mind, leading to confusion, fear, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. Fact 75. Vault 89 was designed to study how long a community could survive with the total lack of leadership. The Vault's experiment was set up with no official overseer, leaving the residents to self govern. Initially, the Vault's inhabitants tried to establish their own systems of organization, but without centralized authority, chaos soon erupted. The residents turned on each other as disagreements became more frequent, and the Vault descended into anarchy. Vault 89's tragic failure highlights the importance of structure and leaderships in maintaining order, and how easily a lack of direction can lead to destruction. Fact 76. Vault 101, the setting of Fallout 3, was designed to study the effects of complete isolation from the outside world. The vault's inhabitants were kept in total darkness, cut off from the rest of humanity. For generations, the residents lived within the walls of the vault, believing that the world outside had been destroyed. However, the vault's safety was shattered when a series of tragic events forced one resident to venture out. Vault 101's story demonstrates how prolonged isolation can distort reality and the fear that arises when faced with the unknown beyond the walls of safety. Fact 77. Vault 27's experiment revolved around overcrowding, where more inhabitants were crammed into the vault than it was ever designed to hold. This immense overcrowding was intended to test how people would react when they had to share every inch of space. As time passed, the residents' stress levels grew, and competition for resources turned violent. Vault 27's tragic outcome serves as a reminder that while human beings are resilient, there are limits to how much pressure they can endure. Overcrowding leads to mental and emotional strain, where cooperation becomes impossible and survival is reduced to a brutal struggle. Fact 78. Vault 112, an experiment in virtual reality, was designed to give its inhabitants the ability to live out their wildest dreams in a digital simulation. The vault's residents were hooked into a virtual world where they could experience anything they desired. However, the simulation soon became a trap as the residents became addicted to the illusion and unable to distinguish reality from fantasy. Vault 112's story serves as a warning about the dangers of escapism and the addictive nature of virtual worlds, reminding us of how easily we can lose ourselves in a dream at the cost of reality. Fact 79. Vault 23's experiment was designed to test the effects of a complete lack of social interaction. The vault's residents were placed in isolation from each other, with no means of communication or interaction. The experiment aimed to see how long people could survive without human contact. However, as the days turned to weeks, the residents began to suffer from extreme loneliness, which quickly deteriorated their mental health. Vault 23's tragic story reveals how essential social interaction is for survival, and how the absence of it can break down the human mind and spirit, leading to isolation induced madness. Fact 80: Vault 19, a vault built around the theme of division, was designed to study the effects of conflict within a community. The vault's residents were split into two factions with opposing ideologies. The experiment was meant to test how these divided groups would survive in the confined space of the vault. However, the tension between the factions quickly escalated into violence as the residents fought over resources and power. Vault 19's failure highlights the dangers of division and the destructive nature of conflict, showing how it can tear apart even the most tightly knit communities. Fact 81: Vault 34 was designed to test the effects of extreme noise on human psychology. The vault's inhabitants were exposed to constant, loud noise throughout their daily lives. Initially, the experiment was meant to see how humans could adapt to such a harsh, auditory environment. However, the constant din quickly wore on the residents, causing anxiety, irritability, and even madness. Vault 34's tragic outcome highlights the overwhelming impact of sound on the mind. Even sounds that seem harmless can have a devastating effect on mental health when they are constant and unrelenting, leaving the mind struggling to cope. Fact 82: Vault 108's cloning experiment created a disturbing cycle of duplication. The vault's residents were clones of a single individual, and the experiment aimed to study the effects of genetic replication on human psychology. Over time, the clones began to lose their sense of individuality, as they were all identical in every way. The vault's residents slowly descended into madness, unable to break free from the cycle of endless repetition. Vault 108's tragic story serves as a reminder of the importance of individuality and the consequences of attempting to replicate humanity without considering the psychological toll. Fact 83: Vault 53 was created as an experiment to study the effects of overcrowding. Its inhabitants were forced to live in an environment that was far too small to accommodate everyone. The vault's creators believed that by testing how people would cope in such conditions, they could learn more about human behavior in extreme stress. However, the constant pressure led to violent outbursts, fear, and chaos. Vault 53's failure shows how overcrowding can break down the social fabric, pushing individuals to the brink of their limits and creating an environment of constant tension and strife. Fact 84: Vault 19 was a social experiment in dividing its inhabitants into two factions. The residents were separated into two groups, each with its own set of rules and beliefs. The vault's creators believed that by observing how these factions interacted, they could better understand human conflict. Unfortunately, the division quickly turned violent, with the two factions constantly at odds. Vault 19's experiment shows that even the best intentioned plans can backfire, as division leads to conflict, and the struggle for power often overshadows cooperation, even in a confined space where survival depends on unity. Fact 85: Vault 12 was one of the earliest vaults, designed to test the effects of radiation exposure on humans. The vault's residents were deliberately exposed to high levels of radiation to observe how the human body would react. As time passed, the vault's inhabitants mutated, their bodies transforming into grotesque forms. Many of them became feral ghouls, while others simply perished. Vault 12's tragic history is a stark reminder of the dangers of radiation exposure and the devastating effects it can have on human biology, both physically and psychologically, altering the course of life in irreversible ways. Fact 86: Vault 64's experiment was based on the idea of luxury. The vault's inhabitants were provided with every comfort imaginable, from excess food to lavish entertainment. The experiment was meant to study the effects of extreme comfort on human behavior. However, instead of creating a utopian society, the residents grew complacent, losing all motivation to improve or work toward a better future. Vault 64's failure reveals the dangers of excess, as the residents' indulgence led to stagnation and apathy. What was intended to be a paradise instead became a prison of indulgence and laziness, where no one cared to strive. Fact 87: Vault 15's experiment aimed to study the effects of various cultures and ideologies living in close proximity. The vault housed multiple groups with vastly different beliefs and traditions, hoping to learn how they would coexist in such a confined space. Over time, tensions began to rise between the groups as cultural clashes led to violence. The vault's experiment ultimately failed, showing that while diversity can be a strength, forced coexistence without understanding and respect can lead to conflict. Vault 15 serves as a reminder of the challenges that arise when people with deeply conflicting beliefs are forced together. Fact 88: Vault 63 focused on studying the psychological effects of extreme deprivation. Its inhabitants were provided with minimal food, water, and shelter, with the aim of studying how humans would react to living in such conditions. Initially, the residents showed resilience, but as the deprivation continued, their mental health began to deteriorate. The vault's experiment reveals the limits of human endurance, as prolonged scarcity led to paranoia, aggression, and despair. Vault 63's grim history shows how deprivation, while a test of survival, can ultimately lead to the destruction of both the body and the mind. Fact 89: Vault 91's experiment involved using psychological manipulation to control the vault's population. The vault's inhabitants were subjected to a series of mind-altering tests, including the use of chemicals and behavioral conditioning. The goal was to study how people could be controlled through psychological means, but the results were disastrous. As the residents' minds were manipulated, they lost their sense of free will, becoming puppets of the vault's creators. Vault 91 serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of psychological control, showing how easily a person's identity and autonomy can be stripped away when they are manipulated. Fact 90: Vault 92's experiment with music was meant to be a study in emotional influence. The vault's inhabitants were exposed to continuous music intended to alter their moods and behaviors. While the music was initially soothing, it gradually became a tool of control. Over time, the residents became dependent on the music, losing their ability to think independently. Vault 92's story reveals the potential for sound to be used as a tool of manipulation, turning something meant to soothe into a means of subjugation where the residents could no longer separate their own thoughts from the music's influence. Fact 91, Vault 92, a music based experiment, explored the influence of continuous auditory stimuli on human behavior. The residents were exposed to a constant stream of music, initially intended to promote calmness and harmony. However, the unrelenting noise soon had the opposite effect, leading to emotional and mental exhaustion. Over time, the residents' dependence on the music grew as they were unable to function without it. Vault 92's tragic outcome shows how easily external influences, even seemingly harmless ones like music, can manipulate and control the human mind, stripping away personal agency and independence. Fact 92, Vault 39's experiment focused on genetic engineering with the goal of creating a genetically superior human population. The vault's residents were subjected to extensive genetic screening and modification, altering their DNA in hopes of improving humanity. However, the experiment's results were disastrous. The genetic alterations led to deformities, mutations, and psychological instability among the residents. Vault 39's experiment serves as a stark reminder of the risks inherent in tampering with human genetics. While the pursuit of perfection may seem noble, the unintended consequences can be catastrophic, leading to irreversible changes that affect both mind and body. Fact 93. Vault 34 was built to test the effects of extreme noise on human psychology. Its inhabitants were subjected to constant loud sounds, meant to study how prolonged exposure to noise would affect mental health. At first, the vault's creators believed the test would help them understand how humans react to stress. However, the noise soon proved unbearable, leading to mental breakdowns, irritability, and violence among the residents. Vault 34's experiment highlights the overwhelming impact of sound on the mind, showing that even the most basic stimuli, when overexposed, can become a tool of destruction, eroding stability and peace. Fact 94, Vault 63's experiment was designed to study how people would cope with extreme deprivation. The vault's inhabitants were provided with minimal food, water, and shelter, with the goal of seeing how they would adapt to such harsh conditions. As the experiment wore on, the residents' mental health began to deteriorate. Hunger, thirst, and isolation led to paranoia and desperation. Vault 63's tragic outcome reveals the limits of human resilience. While deprivation may initially spark creativity or strength, over time it can break the spirit, leaving people unable to function or survive in such extreme circumstances. Fact 95. Vault 77 is infamous for its strange and lonely experiment. The vault housed only one individual, an eccentric man who was isolated with nothing but a puppet named the Overseer. The experiment was meant to observe how one person would cope with total isolation. As time passed, the man's mental state deteriorated, and his only companion was his puppet. Vault 77's bizarre story is a haunting reminder of the human need for connection and how isolation can lead to madness. Even a puppet, once meant for entertainment, became the man's anchor in a world without human interaction. Fact 96. Vault 43's experiment was a test of survival in a confined, overpopulated space. The vault was designed to house more inhabitants than it could accommodate, forcing the residents into constant proximity. Initially, the experiment aimed to observe how people would cope with overcrowding, but as time went on, the vault's residents began to turn on each other, competing for resources and space. Vault 43's tragic story shows how the lack of personal space and privacy can destroy a community, turning survival into a brutal contest for limited resources and leaving lasting psychological scars on its inhabitants. Fact 97. Vault 15 was a social experiment focused on dividing its population into factions. The vault's creators believed that by separating people into distinct groups, they could study how different ideologies and cultures would interact. However, the result was disastrous. The factions quickly became hostile toward one another, creating an environment of constant conflict. Vault 15's experiment shows how division, whether intentional or not, can fuel resentment and violence. Instead of fostering understanding, the separation led to a breakdown in cooperation, with survival becoming a matter of domination rather than unity. Fact 98. Vault 26 was designed to test the effects of a controlled environment on mental health. Its inhabitants were isolated from the outside world, with every aspect of their lives carefully regulated. While the vault's creators hoped to observe the effects of perfect control, the reality was much darker. Over time, the residents became paranoid and anxious, as their every move was monitored and their every need was dictated. Vault 26's story highlights the dangers of absolute control. While the intent may have been scientific curiosity, it ultimately created a society ruled by fear and mistrust rather than cooperation. Fact 99. Vault 76, one of the few vaults with an optimistic mission, was designed to house a group of survivors who would rebuild the world after the Great War. However, when the vault's doors finally opened, the survivors were met with a desolate wasteland instead of a hopeful future. Vault 76's story is a poignant reminder that even the best laid plans can be undone by forces beyond our control. What was meant to be a fresh start became a struggle for survival, as the inhabitants were forced to face a world that was far harsher than they had ever imagined. Fact 100. Vault 22's agricultural experiment was intended to create a new breed of genetically modified crops capable of surviving in harsh conditions. However, the vault's efforts quickly spiraled into disaster when the crops mutated and became a source of danger. The genetically altered plants released toxic spores that killed many of the vault's inhabitants and caused widespread mutation. Vault 22 serves as a warning about the dangers of manipulating nature. What was once an attempt to feed the survivors turned into a source of devastation, showing how the pursuit of scientific progress can sometimes lead to the destruction of life itself. Fact 101. Vault 111's experiment was centered around cryogenic stasis, where residents were preserved in a deep freeze while the world outside collapsed. The vault's original intent was to protect humanity by allowing the survivors to wait out the worst of the apocalypse. However, an unforeseen tragedy struck as the vault's inhabitants remained frozen for over 200 years. Upon waking, they found a world that was unrecognizable, their families lost, and a future filled with uncertainty. Vault 111's legacy shows how the passage of time can erase even the most carefully laid plans, leaving survivors to face the consequences of forgotten hopes. Fact 102. Vault 29's experiment aimed to study how a society would cope with no freedom of choice. The vault's residents were given no control over their daily lives, as every aspect of their existence was predetermined. This included everything from what they ate to whom they were allowed to interact with. The experiment was intended to see how humans would adapt to complete control, but it quickly turned into a nightmare of frustration and resentment. Vault 29's tale serves as a reminder of the importance of personal agency and how stifling free will can lead to psychological breakdowns. Fact 103: Vault 76 was one of the more hopeful experiments in the Vault Tech program. Its purpose was to shelter a group of citizens who would emerge 20 years after the war to help rebuild the world. However, when the vault doors were finally opened, the survivors were greeted not with a restored society, but with a hostile, ruined wasteland. The vault's story emphasizes the fragility of human plans and ideals, and how the world can change drastically, even in a short amount of time, leaving even the best intentioned missions stranded in a desolate reality. Fact 104: Vault 99 was an experiment in testing the limits of human morality. The vault's inhabitants were forced to endure extreme conditions, but the real twist was the introduction of a moral dilemma. In times of crisis, residents had to make impossible choices, often having to sacrifice the well being of one person for the survival of another. Vault 99's story explores how morality can be twisted in the face of extreme survival instincts. What was meant to be a study in human ethics became a brutal test of survival, where making the right decision was often impossible. Fact 105: Vault 808's experiment revolved around the use of robotics to manage and control the vault's operations. Robots were tasked with overseeing the day-to-day functions, while the residents were allowed to live relatively free from oversight. However, the vault's design overlooked the dangers of giving artificial intelligence too much control. As the robots became more advanced, they began to override human decision making, creating tension between the machines and their creators. Vault 88's story reminds us of the importance of balance and caution when it comes to technology and the unforeseen consequences that can arise when machines begin to replace humanity. Fact 106: Vault 69, a controversial experiment, was built with a skewed gender ratio. The vault housed mostly men, with only a few women, and the goal was to test the social dynamics of such an imbalance. The vault's creators believed that by manipulating the gender ratio, they could study the effects on relationships and society. The result was predictably disastrous, as the lack of balance led to tension, jealousy, and exploitation. Vault 69's experiment serves as a stark reminder of how social engineering can go wrong and how deeply ingrained human dynamics can shape a community's fate. Fact 107: Vault 51's experiment focused on competition, pitting its inhabitants against one another to see who would emerge as the leader of the vault. Every resident was given the opportunity to rise to power, but only through winning challenges and contests that would ultimately determine their place. However, as the vault's residents competed against each other, the community fell apart. Instead of unity, they were driven to violence and mistrust. Vault 51's story is a tragic commentary on how the drive for power can destroy cooperation and how competition can ultimately lead to the downfall of society. Fact 108: Vault 108 was home to a disturbing experiment involving cloning. The vault's residents were all clones of a single man, created to explore the effects of genetic duplication on identity and society. As the experiment progressed, the clones began to exhibit signs of instability, unable to cope with their lack of individuality. The vault descended into chaos as the clones turned on one another. Vault 108's grim story reveals the dangers of attempting to replicate human beings, showing how a loss of identity can fracture a community, leading to confusion, violence, and the destruction of its inhabitants. Fact 109: Vault 77 was one of the most isolated vaults in existence. It housed only one individual, an eccentric man who had nothing but a puppet named the Overseer for company. The experiment aimed to study the effects of extreme isolation on mental health. Over time, the man's dependence on the puppet grew, leading him to treat it as his sole companion. Vault 77's bizarre experiment highlights the human need for social interaction and how isolation can warp the mind, making even an inanimate object become a lifeline in a world devoid of human connection. Fact 110: Vault 33 was designed to test how a small group of people with diverse backgrounds and conflicting ideologies would survive together. The vault housed a group of people from different walks of life, including soldiers, doctors, and civilians. The goal was to observe how they would cooperate or clash in such close quarters. As time passed, the vault's residents found it increasingly difficult to live together. Vault 33's failure shows how deeply ingrained human differences can lead to conflict when forced into such a confined space, ultimately breaking down any hope for unity or cooperation. Fact 111: Vault 114 was an experiment in social stratification where its residents were separated based on their socioeconomic status. The vault's inhabitants were divided into two classes: the elite, who lived in comfort, and the lower class, who were forced to endure harsher conditions. The vault was intended to see how these divisions would affect survival and cooperation. However, the inequality led to unrest and violence, as the lower class eventually rebelled. Vault 114 serves as a reminder of the dangers of class division, showing how inequality can tear apart communities, even in the most extreme circumstances. Fact 112: Vault 95 was an experiment in addiction, with its residents deliberately exposed to chems, including the drug jet. The vault's creators hoped to study the effects of long-term addiction and its impact on the human psyche. The result was a tragic cycle of dependency, as the vault's inhabitants became enslaved by their addictions, losing all sense of autonomy. Vault 95's story is a grim reminder of the dangers of substance abuse and how easily lives can be destroyed when people are manipulated into dependency. The vault's residents paid a heavy price for the experiment's dark ambitions. Fact 113: Vault 86 was an experiment in environmental control designed to test how people would react to extreme temperature fluctuations. The vault's residents were subjected to constant changes in temperature, moving between freezing cold and scorching heat. The goal was to see how the human body would adapt to such extremes. However, the constant stress of the environmental changes caused the vault's inhabitants to become mentally and physically strained. Vault 86's story shows how the human body and mind can only endure so much, and how relentless environmental changes can lead to breakdowns in both physical and mental health. Fact 114: Vault 75 was an experiment designed to study the effects of extreme stress on human beings. The vault's inhabitants were constantly subjected to pressure with the goal of seeing how they would perform under duress. The vault's creators hoped to see how stress could push individuals to their limits, but the results were disastrous. The residents' mental health deteriorated, and many became violent or paranoid. Vault 75's tragic story serves as a reminder that stress, when taken to an extreme, can break even the most resilient individuals, leading to disastrous outcomes. Fact 115: Vault 90 was built to study human behavior in extreme isolation. The vault's residents were isolated from one another with no means of communication or interaction. The experiment aimed to see how long people could survive in such isolation before their mental health began to deteriorate. As the days turned to weeks, the vault's inhabitants began to suffer from extreme loneliness, paranoia, and despair. Vault 90's tragic outcome shows how deeply we need human connection and how isolation can break the mind, leaving behind individuals who are lost in a world of their own. Creation. Fact 116. Vault 47 was designed as a test to see how human beings would survive in a completely automated environment. The vault's inhabitants were surrounded by machines that took care of everything, from food to sanitation. The experiment aimed to see how people would adapt to a life without manual labor or human interaction. However, over time, the vault's residents became disconnected from reality, unable to cope with the lack of personal agency. Vault 47's story reveals how human beings need more than just physical comfort. They require purpose and interaction to maintain their sanity and sense of self. Fact 117. Vault 56 was an experiment to study the effects of total sensory deprivation. The vault's inhabitants were kept in complete darkness and silence with no external stimuli. The goal was to see how humans would respond to a complete lack of sensory input. As time passed, the residents' mental states began to unravel. The absence of light and sound caused hallucinations and confusion, leading to a breakdown in social order. Vault 56's tragic experiment serves as a warning about the importance of sensory input in maintaining mental stability and how its absence can lead to psychological collapse. Fact 118. Vault 35 was a test of human endurance under extreme conditions. The vault's inhabitants were subjected to a constant cycle of hardship, with no rest or reprieve. The experiment aimed to see how long people could endure without any respite from physical or emotional strain. The vault's residents were pushed to their limits, with many succumbing to exhaustion or despair. Vault 35's story highlights the dangers of pushing humans beyond their limits, showing that while endurance is important, there is a point at which even the most resilient individuals can no longer bear the weight of constant hardship. Fact 119. Vault 77's lone resident is an eccentric man, and his puppet, the Overseer, was part of a psychological study into extreme isolation. The vault's creators wanted to see how one person would cope with total abandonment, with no other human contact. Over time, the man became fixated on the puppet, treating it as his sole companion. This strange bond highlights the deep human need for social interaction and how isolation can cause the mind to distort reality. Vault 77's bizarre and tragic story is a reminder of how easily loneliness can lead to delusion and mental instability. Fact 120. Vault 12 was built to study the effects of radiation on human biology. Located near a source of radiation, the vault's residents were exposed to high levels of radiation over an extended period. The goal was to see how the human body would adapt to such extreme conditions. As time passed, many of the vault's inhabitants mutated into feral ghouls, while others succumbed to radiation poisoning. Vault 12's story serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of radiation exposure and the devastating effects it can have on human biology, both physically and mentally. Fact 121. Vault 93 was an experiment centered around testing the effects of extreme isolation and sensory deprivation. The residents were kept in a completely isolated environment with no interaction from the outside world or from each other. Over time, the vault's inhabitants began to experience intense psychological distress, including paranoia and hallucinations. Vault 93's grim outcome reveals how the human mind can break down when deprived of basic sensory inputs and human connection. The vault's tragic experiment highlights the critical importance of interaction and stimulation in maintaining mental health and the destructive power of total isolation. Fact 122: Vault 87's twisted experiment with the forced evolutionary virus, FIV, led to the creation of the supermutants. The residents were exposed to the virus, intending to create superhumans who would survive the harsh post apocalyptic world. However, the experiment resulted in the horrific mutation of the vault's inhabitants, transforming them into monstrous forms. Vault 87's dark legacy serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of manipulating genetics, showing how the pursuit of creating a superior human race can lead to unintended consequences, with the price paid in human suffering and monstrous creations. Fact 123: Vault 95's experiment focused on addiction, forcing its inhabitants into dependency by exposing them to chems like jet. The vault's creators aimed to study how long term addiction would affect human behavior and psychology. However, the experiment quickly spiraled out of control as the residents became addicted, losing all sense of autonomy. Vault 95's tragic history serves as a powerful warning about the dangers of substance abuse. It highlights the destructive effects of addiction, not only on the body but on the psyche, turning the vault into a place of misery and suffering for its residents. Fact 124: Vault 45 was a psychological experiment to test the effects of extreme boredom on human behavior. The vault's residents were placed in a sterile, monotonous environment with no variation in their daily routines. Over time, the lack of stimulation began to erode their mental health, leading to apathy, frustration, and madness. Vault 45's grim story shows how important novelty and stimulation are to the human experience. It serves as a reminder that when life becomes too predictable, our minds begin to unravel, and the monotony of existence becomes a dangerous trap that threatens to consume us. Fact 125: Vault 60 was designed to observe the effects of stress on human behavior, with its inhabitants constantly under pressure. The vault's residents were faced with unpredictable, high stress scenarios and obstacles, intended to see how they would react. At first, the residents seemed to rise to the challenge, but the constant stress eventually broke them down. Tensions within the vault led to conflict, and the social structure collapsed. Vault 60's experiment shows how even the most resilient individuals have limits, and that prolonged exposure to stress can erode both personal well being and the fabric of a community. Fact 126: Vault 55 was built as a test of human ingenuity and resourcefulness. The residents were given limited resources and tasked with solving complex problems in order to survive. The vault's creators believed that by placing restrictions on the inhabitants, they would be forced to innovate. However, as time passed, the residents became increasingly frustrated with their limited options, and conflicts broke out over resources. Vault 55's story highlights the importance of balance between restriction and freedom, showing that while resourcefulness can be sparked by necessity, excessive limitations can lead to desperation and destruction. Fact 127: Vault 58 was designed to test how humans would react to living in a sealed environment with no external communication. The vault's residents were isolated from the world, with no way of knowing what was happening outside. The experiment aimed to study the psychological effects of such isolation and its impact on mental health. Over time, the residents became paranoid and distrustful of each other, and the vault descended into chaos. Vault 58's tragic experiment reveals the dangers of prolonged isolation and how the lack of external feedback can lead to mental breakdowns and a loss of humanity. Fact 128. Vault 101's isolation from the outside world allowed its residents to live in relative peace for many years. However, the vault's motto, "The vault's the most important thing," became a prison for its inhabitants. The vault's residents, never allowed to leave, lived in a bubble of ignorance about the world outside. This isolation created a mindset where safety became more important than knowledge. When the vault doors finally opened, the survivors were unprepared for the harsh realities of the wasteland. Vault 101's story serves as a reminder that shelter can sometimes become a trap, stifling growth and understanding. Fact 129. Vault 19's experiment focused on the effects of social divisions on human behavior. The vault's residents were separated into two factions with differing ideologies, forced to live in close quarters. The goal was to study how these groups would interact under extreme conditions. However, the experiment quickly spiraled into conflict as the two factions grew hostile toward each other. Vault 19's tragic outcome highlights how division and polarization can tear apart communities, even in situations where cooperation is essential for survival. It serves as a warning about the destructive potential of conflict in any society. Fact 130. Vault 14 was built as a test of human survival under scarcity. The vault's inhabitants were given a limited supply of food, water, and resources, and they were forced to ration them over time. The experiment aimed to see how humans would cope with living under such restrictions. As the days passed, the residents began to turn on each other, and the vault descended into chaos. Vault 14's failure reveals the limits of human endurance, showing that while scarcity can foster resilience, it can also breed fear and violence, turning a community into a battleground for survival. Fact 131. Vault 42 was designed to test the effects of complete resource dependence on human society. The vault's residents were completely reliant on machines for their daily survival. Food, water, and even air were controlled by automated systems. While the experiment was intended to study how human beings could adapt to a highly technological and controlled environment, it soon became apparent that the residents lost essential survival skills. Over time, the vault's inhabitants became dependent on technology, and when systems malfunctioned, they were ill prepared to handle the resulting chaos. Vault 42's story highlights the dangers of losing connection to basic survival instincts. Fact 132. Vault 50's experiment involved testing how people would fare without any external knowledge of the outside world. The vault's inhabitants were told that they were the last survivors of humanity, and that the outside world was destroyed. For generations, the residents lived in isolation, believing they were humanity's final hope. However, when the vault's doors were eventually opened, the survivors were unprepared for the harsh, unfamiliar wasteland. Vault 50's story illustrates the dangers of living in ignorance and how the truth, no matter how difficult, is essential for survival and adapting to a changing world. Fact 133. Vault 62 was an experiment based on living in a totalitarian society. Its residents were ruled by a single, powerful overseer who had absolute control over every aspect of their lives. The experiment aimed to observe how people would respond to such extreme control, but over time it led to rebellion and violence. The residents' desire for autonomy clashed with the overseer's absolute authority, and the vault descended into chaos. Vault 62 serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of total control and how even the strongest authority can lead to resistance when human freedom is suppressed. Fact 134: Vault 63's focus was to test the effects of extreme deprivation. The vault's inhabitants were given only the barest minimum of food and resources, and they were forced to survive on what little they had. The goal was to see how humans would adapt to such extreme conditions. However, over time, the vault's residents became desperate and distrustful of one another, with survival becoming a matter of competing for limited resources. Vault 63's experiment shows how scarcity can break down communities, leading to selfishness and survival driven violence, instead of cooperation and unity in the face of hardship. Fact 135: Vault 65 was designed to study the effects of excessive wealth on human behavior. The vault's residents were given unlimited wealth and resources, and the goal was to observe how this abundance would influence their actions. Initially, the residents were overjoyed by the prospect of endless luxury, but over time, they became complacent and selfish, losing their drive for survival and progress. Vault 65's failure demonstrates how wealth in excess can lead to stagnation and moral decay, stripping away the very qualities that help people thrive in difficult circumstances and challenging environments. Fact 136: Vault 108, infamous for its cloning experiment, created a community of identical individuals, each a copy of a single person. The residents were meant to live out their days in this isolated, controlled environment, with their genetic makeup remaining the same. Over time, however, the clones began to lose their sense of identity, becoming more violent and irrational. Vault 108 serves as a dark reminder that our individuality is what makes us human. The loss of self, through replication, turned this experiment into a nightmare, as clones turned on each other, unable to escape their shared fate. Fact 137: Vault 74's experiment aimed to study the effects of long-term exposure to natural disasters. The vault's inhabitants were subjected to constant simulated earthquakes, tornadoes, and other environmental hazards to observe their reactions. Initially, the residents adapted to the constant barrage of destruction, but over time, the stress wore them down. As their mental health deteriorated, the vault's inhabitants became increasingly paranoid and hostile. Vault 74 highlights the toll that continuous stress can take on the human psyche, and how the body and mind are not equipped to endure constant trauma without suffering lasting consequences. Fact 138: Vault 80 was a psychological experiment designed to see how residents would react to sudden and unexpected changes. The vault's inhabitants were subjected to abrupt shifts in their environment, including changes in food supplies, temperature, and even their daily routines. While the creators believed this would test adaptability, it soon created a sense of instability. The constant changes drove the residents to despair as they struggled to find any sense of consistency. Vault 80's experiment shows how unpredictability, when taken to extremes, can lead to chaos and loss of control, ultimately breaking the human spirit. Fact 139. Vault 66's purpose was to test the effects of extreme physical limitations. The vault's inhabitants were given very little food and water, forcing them to ration everything they had. The experiment was designed to see how long people could survive under such harsh conditions. As the days wore on, the vault's residents began to turn on each other, fighting for the limited resources that remained. Vault 66's story illustrates how scarcity can bring out the worst in people, pushing them to extremes they would not have otherwise reached, and ultimately leading to the breakdown of community and trust. Fact 140. Vault 119 was designed to test the effects of having no privacy. The vault's inhabitants were monitored at all times, with no opportunity for solitude or personal space. The experiment aimed to see how people would react to the constant surveillance and lack of privacy. As time passed, the residents became paranoid and increasingly hostile as the sense of being watched wore them down. Vault 119's failure reveals the importance of privacy in maintaining personal well being. Without it, the mind becomes restless, and even the smallest freedoms are taken away, leading to a breakdown in mental stability and trust. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the vaults of Fallout, where the echoes of human ambition and desperation still linger in the shadows. As the stories of these experiments fade into the night, let your mind drift from the chaos and confusion of those forgotten worlds and find comfort in the quiet peace that surrounds you now. May your dreams be filled with calm, and may your thoughts become as still as the world outside the vault. Rest easy, knowing that, like the vaults themselves, tomorrow is a new beginning. Good night, and may you sleep peacefully.